For decades, Joel Osteen built a reputation that seemed almost untouchable, a smiling pastor who avoided conflict, refused to preach fear, and turned faith into something that felt accessible to millions. But behind that carefully maintained image, a pattern had been forming, one controversy after another, each one raising new questions that never fully went away. Now those questions are louder than ever, and the story people once believed about him is starting to look very different. What follows isn't one moment. It's a chain of events that slowly led here. The reluctant successor who changed the message. Long before Joel Osteen became a global figure, his path was anything but traditional. Born in Houston, he was the son of Joel Osteen, who founded Lakewood Church in a small converted feed store. While his father built the ministry, Joel stayed behind the scenes, focusing on media instead of preaching. After briefly attending Oral Roberts University, he dropped out and returned home to build the church's television program, helping it reach audiences far beyond Houston. For nearly 17 years, he avoided the pulpit entirely. Even as his mother Dodie and sister Lisa preached, Joel repeatedly said no. He preferred producing broadcasts over standing in front of crowds, shaping Lakewood's growth through media rather than ministry. That choice defined him early on, not as a preacher, but as a strategist building a platform. Everything changed in January 1999. After years of refusing, he finally agreed to preach. On January 17th, he delivered his first sermon to about 6,000 people. Just 6 days later, his father died of a heart attack. The timing forced a sudden transition. By October, Joel was installed as senior pastor, stepping into a role he had never planned to take. Instead of copying his father's intense scripture-driven style, Joel shifted the entire message. He focused on encouragement, positivity, and personal growth, avoiding heavy doctrine and controversial topics. His sermons were carefully memorized and delivered with precision, creating a consistent and accessible tone that appealed to a wider audience. That shift transformed Lakewood. By 2003, the church moved into the Compaq Center, a former arena with more than 16,000 seats. Attendance surged, televised services reached millions, and Joel's books became bestsellers. What started as a small local church turned into a global brand driven not just by faith, but by a message designed for mass appeal. The message that built an empire and sparked a backlash. As Joel Osteen expanded his reach, his message became the center of both his success and the criticism that followed. Unlike traditional pastors who emphasized sin, repentance, and doctrine, he deliberately chose a different direction. He described himself not as a theologian, but as an encourager. His sermons focused on confidence, mindset, and the belief that a better life was not only possible, but expected. He repeatedly told audiences that God wanted them to succeed, to be healthy, and to live with peace of mind. For millions of listeners, that message felt refreshing. For critics, it raised serious concerns. The turning point came when his teachings were increasingly associated with what many call the prosperity gospel, a belief that faithfulness leads to material and personal rewards. While Osteen often tried to soften that label by saying prosperity included emotional well-being and family stability, he never fully rejected the idea that success and faith were connected. That ambiguity created tension. Supporters saw hope. Critics saw something else entirely, a system that in their view reframed religion as a pathway to personal gain rather than spiritual depth. This debate reached a wider audience during a televised interview on a major national program where Osteen was asked a direct question about salvation. Instead of giving a clear doctrinal answer, he responded cautiously, saying he didn't feel comfortable deciding who would or wouldn't go to heaven. He spoke about people from different backgrounds, including those he had met internationally, and emphasized sincerity over certainty. The response spread quickly, and it triggered backlash almost immediately. Many viewers felt he had avoided the core of the question, especially when it came to the role of Jesus in Christian belief. Within days, he issued a public clarification stating that he did believe salvation comes through Christ, and that his earlier answer had not reflected his full position. Even with that clarification, the perception had already shifted. The incident exposed a pattern that critics had been pointing out for years: his tendency to avoid firm positions in favor of broader, more inclusive language. For some, that approach made him accessible to a global audience. For others, it made his message feel incomplete. The criticism didn't just come from outsiders. Prominent theologians began openly challenging his teachings, arguing that his sermons reduced complex religious ideas into simplified feel-good statements. One described his message as cotton candy, something appealing but lacking substance. Another went further, accusing him of reshaping Christianity into a form of motivational speaking. At the same time, his personal success made the conversation even more complicated. His books sold in the millions, often debuting at the top of bestseller lists. He stopped taking a salary from the church and instead relied on publishing and speaking engagements, with reports indicating he could earn tens of thousands of dollars for a single appearance. His net worth was widely estimated in the tens of millions, with some figures reaching even higher. He and his family lived in a 17,000-square-foot home in one of Houston's most affluent neighborhoods, a detail that became impossible to ignore as his public profile grew. When real-world crisis exposed the image, the shift from theological criticism to public controversy didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it was triggered by something far more serious than debate. It was a real-world disaster. In late August, Hurricane Harvey struck Texas and turned large parts of Houston into flood zones. The storm caused more than 100 deaths, flooded entire neighborhoods, and forced thousands of people out of their homes. In moments like that, public figures are no longer judged by what they say, but by what they do. And for Joel Osteen, this became one of the most defining moments of his career. At the center of the controversy was Lakewood Church itself, a 16,800-seat arena that had once been a professional basketball venue. Given its size and location, many assumed it would immediately open its doors to those in need of shelter. Instead, the church initially stated that the building was inaccessible due to severe flooding and directed people to other shelters across the city. That explanation might have ended the story, but it didn't. Within hours, people began sharing photos and videos online that appeared to show the church largely unaffected, at least from the outside. The contrast between what was being said and what people believed they were seeing ignited a wave of backlash that spread rapidly across social media. Criticism came from all directions. Some questioned why one of the largest churches in the country wasn't acting immediately. Others pointed to Osteen's wealth and influence, arguing that he had both the resources and the responsibility to respond faster. The conversation quickly moved beyond logistics and into perception. It wasn't just about whether the building was safe. It was about timing, leadership, and expectations. By the time Lakewood announced it would open as a shelter, the narrative had already taken shape. When the church did open its doors, hundreds of volunteers arrived, and around 300 people were ultimately housed there. That was a tangible response, but it didn't erase what had already happened. The delay, combined with earlier statements about waiting until other shelters reached capacity, became the focus of the criticism. In interviews that followed, Osteen defended the decision, explaining that the church had concerns about safety and that the city had not initially requested Lakewood to serve as a shelter. He also acknowledged that in hindsight, he would have prepared differently by bringing in staff and supplies earlier. However, some of his comments during that period only intensified the reaction. In one interview, he suggested that social media had created a misleading narrative, and in another moment, he stated that if the church had opened and then flooded with evacuees inside, that would have created an even worse situation. While those explanations were meant to clarify his reasoning, many people saw them as defensive rather than accountable. The gap between intention and perception became impossible to close. What made the situation even more damaging was the comparison that emerged at the same time. While Osteen was explaining his decisions on national television, another Houston figure was being praised for immediate action: opening businesses, rescuing stranded residents, and providing shelter without hesitation. That contrast didn't just highlight different responses, it reshaped how people interpreted leadership during a crisis. For many observers, It became a defining example of what they believed Osteen's approach lacked: the money questions that wouldn't go away. After the Hurricane Harvey controversy reshaped how people viewed his leadership, attention shifted to something even more sensitive: money. For years, financial questions around Joel Osteen and Lakewood Church had existed in the background, but they had never fully broken into mainstream scrutiny. That changed as more details about the church's finances, spending, and decisions began to surface, creating a narrative that was harder to control. One of the biggest points of tension was transparency. Because Lakewood operates as a tax-exempt religious organization, it is not required to publicly disclose detailed financial records. That legal structure is common for churches, but in Lakewood's case, the scale made it different. The church had an annual budget reported to be around $89 to $90 million, employed hundreds of staff members, and maintained a global media presence that reached millions of households. Yet, critics pointed out that the public had limited visibility into how that money was allocated. Independent watchdog groups gave the church extremely low ratings for financial transparency, with one report assigning a failing grade and a donor confidence score near the bottom of the scale. Those numbers didn't prove wrongdoing, but they amplified suspicion. The conversation intensified when reports suggested that only a small percentage of the church's income, less than 1.5% in one fiscal year, went directly to charitable causes. That figure, approximately $1.2 million out of nearly $89 million in income, became a focal point for critics who argued that a church of that size should be contributing more to direct aid. Supporters countered that Lakewood's mission extended beyond traditional charity, pointing to its services, outreach programs, and global broadcasts. But once the number was public, it became difficult to ignore, especially in the context of earlier controversies. Then came an incident that sounded almost impossible to believe. Years earlier, in 2014, Lakewood had reported that roughly $600,000 in cash and checks had been stolen from its safe. Despite an investigation and a reward offer, no arrests were made, and the case went cold. More than 7 years later, in November 2021, a plumber working inside the church made a discovery that reignited the story. While repairing a loose toilet in a public restroom, he removed part of a wall and found hundreds of envelopes hidden inside, many containing cash, checks, and money orders. Authorities later confirmed that evidence from those checks suggested a connection to the original theft. The exact amount recovered was never publicly detailed, and because the statute of limitations had already expired, no charges could be filed. The explanation offered was that someone may have hidden the money with the intention of retrieving it later, only for it to become inaccessible. Even so, the situation left unanswered questions, and the unusual nature of the discovery kept it in the headlines far longer than expected. Around the same period, another financial decision drew widespread attention. During the global shutdown, when in-person services were suspended for months, Lakewood applied for and received $4.4 million in federal Paycheck Protection Program funds. The loan was intended to support employee salaries and benefits, including health insurance, during a period of uncertainty. On paper, the decision aligned with the program's purpose. In practice, it triggered backlash. Many people questioned why one of the largest churches in the country, with significant resources and a global platform, would accept government assistance. The reaction was immediate and intense, with calls for greater accountability and even broader debates about whether large religious institutions should have access to such funds at all. The moment everything changed. By the time the next major event unfolded, the public perception of Joel Osteen was already under pressure. Years of criticism, financial scrutiny, and high-profile